Welcome to Messaging Layer Security towards a new era of secure messaging with Raphael Robert. I just have a few housekeeping announcements before we begin. So stop by the business hall located in Mandalay Bay, Oceanside, and Shoreline. Level 2, that would be this level. The welcome reception is tonight at 5:30 p.m. The Black Hat Arsenal is in the business hall, level 2. You can join us for the Pawnee Awards, Lagoon JKL at 6:30 p.m. as well. Please remember to put your phone in silence mode. And if we run out of time, we will take the speaker will take more questions at the wrap room, which is located in level 2. So just come up front at the end, and we'll take you there. So please, everyone, give a warm welcome to our speaker today, to Raphael Robert. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. Hello and welcome. Today, in this session, we're going to be talking about MLS, messaging layer security. Can we do a very quick show of hands who has heard of MLS before? That's roughly 25%. And who has read the specification out of these people? Anyone? No. Good. Then you're in the right talk. So, for those who haven't heard of it, in a nutshell, MLS is a new protocol for end-to-end encrypted messaging. And it is also, by now, an IETF working group. This is essentially the framework in which MLS is being developed. And the question is, why is this important now? Why do we need a new encryption protocol? We already have a few there, and so why do we need to do a new one? Is there a new problem to solve or an old problem that hasn't been solved yet? So in the first part of the talk, we're going to look into that, what the current status is in terms of secure messaging, and then we're going to talk more about MLS. And so I'm Raphael Robert. I work for Wire, which is a secure messenger and collaboration platform, and I've been quite involved in the MLS effort in the past months and years. But I was supposed to speak with Benjamin today, who unfortunately couldn't attend, so it's just going to be me today. But it's really not just the two of us. It's actually a bunch of companies that are involved in MLS. So all these companies you see there, to some extent, they think there is a fundamental problem to solve when it comes to secure messaging. And this is what motivated them to cooperate on this level. And you can also see there's a number of institutions and universities on there. So we have a lot of input, very fundamental input from academia, which is something that in 2019 you absolutely want to have when you design a secure protocol. And since MLS is an IETF working group, it is completely open. So anyone can participate in the traditional way that IETF works. There's a mailing list. Anyone can come to the meetings that are held 3 times a year, and then the interim meetings in between. So, as I said, we're going to quickly look at what the current status is with existing messaging. What are the common issues? What problems have been solved so far, and what problems remain? And also look a bit at the history. So today we have a lot of secure messaging apps, and some of them use the same or similar protocols. Some are quite different, but they all have the same challenge at the end of the day, and that is, how do you end-to-end encrypt messages? The level of analysis from academia is very different across the different apps. Some of them use a protocol that is very well studied and very well understood. Others have not really been audited that much. And many of them have their own libraries. And the question is, how do these protocols compare? In terms of level of analysis, in terms of threat models that they're trying to address, and in terms of features that they enable. So if We start with security first, the security properties we've had in past protocols. So in the 90s we had PGP, OpenPGP, S-MIME, which is fundamentally very similar to each other. And that was really the beginning of end-to-end encryption in the consumer and business space. And it came with two very fundamental security properties, which is confidentiality and authenticity. So confidentiality simply means things are encrypted, it's confidential, a third party cannot look into it. Authenticity means that you actually know who encrypted it. So you can be sure who the author of a message is. Years later, in the early 2000s, the off-the-record protocol saw the day of light, and this was actually adapting to a more modern environment and trying to address a very specific threat model. And it introduced two new security properties, which are forward secrecy and deniability. So the idea behind that protocol was that somebody should be able to have a confidential conversation with, say, a journalist, and the properties of that conversation, even though it was digital, should mimic what happens in real life. Of when two people meet and there is no recording of the conversation. So we're going to talk about these properties in more detail later. And then after that came the double ratchet algorithm, which is a very fundamental one. And that has been the basis of the Signal protocol, for example. And what it did, it really adapted the off-the-record protocol to a new environment which had to be asynchronous. So all of a sudden there were smartphones. And sometimes they're online, sometimes they're offline, sometimes they're in between, you don't know what it is. So while the off-the-record protocol was based on a session, back then this was not good enough on smartphones anymore because there was no concept of a session. And it also introduced a new notion of future secrecy, and we'll look at that in more detail later. But what's common to all these protocols is that they're all designed for encryption between two ends, hence end-to-end encryption. So we call them pairwise protocol because they're there to encrypt things between A and B. And you can also see that these protocols influence each other over time. So of course, of the record is also confidential and authenticated, and so is double ratchet. They're just added to the security properties. So the question here is, if all of these protocols are pairwise, what do we do about groups? What do we do when we have more than two ends? That's the case in a group of three, naturally. It's also the case if you have a multi-device setup, which is very common these days. You have a tablet, you have a PC, you have a smartphone. And so the fundamental problem is that these pairwise protocols, they cannot just be extended to work in groups. You cannot just add ends to it, because that's not how those protocols were designed initially. And what typically happens is that you simulate a group by superposing these one-to-one connections. So if Alice is in a group and wants to talk to everybody, wants to send a message, she will individually encrypt the message to everybody in the group. So this works, of course, and you get the same kind of security properties you have in one-to-one. The problem here is that it doesn't scale very well, because if the group is big, you have to do a lot of encryption operations. And so there seems to be a trade-off between security properties and scalability. And we're going to look at that in more detail in a bit. So the problem is also that when you create a group on top of these pairwise protocols, so you use these pairwise protocols as a building brick, then whatever you do on top is not part of this secure protocol. So even if the protocol is very secure, what you do on top is something else entirely. So you add a layer of group management, which typically is not standard at all. So every app vendor comes up with their own idea on how to solve that. And so the security properties you get there, they might be different. And so also the analysis of this group management layer is often not there at all, or it's very thin. So it would actually be great to combine the two and then to analyze the two. So going back to this trade-off, so if we have a very simple graph, on the x-axis we have how modern the security of the protocol is, on the y-axis we have an indication of how well it scales in group. So then in the lower left corner we have encrypted email with SMI and OpenPGP, because the security is not really modern anymore, and it doesn't scale well, because if you send an email to more than one recipient, you typically encrypt it more than once. So what is good in terms of modern security is what we call client fan-out. So this is essentially all the applications that are going to encrypt the messages multiple times to all the recipients in a group with the modern security properties. And then we have this trade-off, which is essentially a hack. So doing client fan-out doesn't scale well enough in the real world for a number of companies, obviously. So the hack here is to use something called sender keys. And this is being used by WhatsApp, Facebook, and others, simply because it scales a little better, but we have this security trade-off. And so the question is, what could we do in the upper right corner? It would be interesting to be there, actually. So if you think a bit of the objectives that we want for a new protocol, if we could make a wish list, what would it look like? Let's start with the security first and the modern security properties. So we already talked about confidentiality and authenticity. That should absolutely be there. Though there are still some products out there that don't really surface the authenticity part to the user, so you sort of have to believe that it's there. Then forward secrecy. Essentially what forward secrecy means is that if there is a compromise at some point of an endpoint and an attacker can get the keys at a certain point in time, then forward secrecy means that these keys or the compromised endpoint is not going to enable the attacker to go back in time and to decrypt all the history, even if the attacker had been able to record it in encrypted form on the network. And then we sort of have the opposite in terms of time. We have post-compromise security. So earlier I mentioned future secrecy. This is a more academic definition of that. It's also much more recent than forward secrecy. And what this means is that there is a way to recover after a compromise. And so these two properties are what constitute modern protocols, and we'll go into more detail even a bit further. Also, what you would like is to have membership authentication. You would like to know exactly, with some cryptographic proof, of who's in a group. And this is not really what pairwise protocols can do, because they don't have the notion of a group whatsoever. And then deniability, which was introduced with OTR, which on a very high level means that if Alice sends a message to Bob, for example, then Bob cannot prove to a third party that Alice is really the author of that message. But Bob knows for himself that Alice sent it, in fact. There are different kinds of deniability. We'll have a slide about that later. So what else do we want aside from the security? So security is good, but it also needs to work. So we need some features that make it work in the real world. So it needs to be asynchronous. I already mentioned smartphones are ubiquitous these days. And so you don't want to wait for the other party to come online to initiate a secure session. You just want to send out a message and forget about it, and you expect the other party is going to receive it at some point and be able to decrypt it and read it. And we want good security in groups while the scaling should still be efficient. We don't want this trade-off necessarily. We also want multi-device. So multi-device is another aspect of groups. You just add more ends to the end-to-end encryption. Another aspect is federation. So it would be great if you would not be limited to one server or one service when you do end-to-end encryption. And very importantly, the whole thing also needs to be usable. So you need to focus on a new protocol to be really practical. Finally, we'd like it to be an open standard. So anybody should be able to read the specification and implement it, understand it, and comment on it. And if there are implementations already, it would be great if they can be reused and they're completely compatible to each other. And lastly, you want the security analysis from academia, which is really very important when coming up with new protocols. And we've had great examples of that. So TLS 1.3, for example, is such a protocol that has been developed with the help of different universities. And so we're trying to align MLS to that as well. So now let's finally talk about MLS. Tell a little bit of history. In 2015, there was a first cryptographic technical proposal from the University of Oxford called asynchronous ratcheting trees, which kicked off a technical debate. And in 2016, there were more stakeholders who gathered and started discussing what could be done on the technical side, whether it should be standardized, if there was a common problem in the industry. And all of that led to Birds of a Feather in March 2018 at the IETF in London. And then in May, the working group was officially formed, and ever since, MLS has been developed in that working group. And as I mentioned, TLS has been a great inspiration. So if we look at the scope, what problem we're trying to solve and what the scope should be, again, we can look at the scope of TLS first. So TLS solved a security problem. We have a transport layer, which is TCP or UDP typically, and on top of that, we have protocols that build up on this transport layer, HTTP, SMTP, etc. And so TLS fits in here and secures this transport layer, as the name says. And in terms of scope, it goes along with a way to authenticate, which is typically a PKI. And it doesn't really define how that works. That is out of the scope of TLS. But it defines how the interface works. So you all know that from browsers, you have certificates. And so TLS understands what a certificate is, but it doesn't care about where it comes from and how it's being handled, etc. So MLS is supposed to be very similar. We have transport encryption as a base layer. And then we have an application layer on which messages are being exchanged. And this is the reality for all messengers that don't really have any sort of end-to-end encryption. There's transport encryption and there's the application layer and clear text above that. So this is where MLS should fit in. Similarly, we have an authentication service, which is also not completely specified. We really only want to specify the interface because at the end of the day, there might be really different systems of authentication. PKIs, vendors have different ideas about that. On a very high level, on the architecture level, we have this authentication service, which we're going to leave alone for now. And then we have a delivery service. So this is on the server side. Simply, as the name says, it is a component that is going to deliver end-to-end encrypted messages mostly. And so you have a bunch of clients. There can be more than one client per user. And all of them, at the end of the day, they're part of a group. So MLS really cares about groups as a notion. Going back to TLS, there are differences also beyond the similarities. So in groups, we could have a lot of people. TLS is really point-to-point. We can have very long-lived sessions in groups. They could exist for months or years, and TLS typically it's seconds or minutes at best. We have a lot of mobile devices involved, so the asynchronicity problem comes up again, which for TLS is not that important. Also, clearly, MLS is designed for human-to-human communication, whereas TLS can be used between two servers, for example. And so with these long sessions, there is a very significant probability that some of the endpoints are going to get compromised. I mean, I think this is an audience I don't need to explain to that endpoints can get compromised. So this is again where we go back to forward secrecy and post-compromise security and look a bit at how that works. So we assume there's going to be a compromise and we want the past messages to be secure. If they've been deleted, for example. So an attacker who has collected all the encrypted messages on the network, for example, should not be able to now decrypt all of them. And conversely, when we look at the future, we want to recover from such a situation. We want, for example, if somebody in a group loses a phone, which happens rather frequently, we don't want the whole group to be compromised forever because that phone was lost. So we want to actually be able to go forward with that. And even if the phone was just briefly compromised, but the attacker doesn't have any persistent compromise, then we can also recover from that. Of course, if an attacker is forever compromising an endpoint, then it's sort of game over, but that is by design. Then we have what we call a malicious insider. So how do we get forward secrecy and post-compromise security? We do a lot of key rotations. So whenever we have new keys, then we can also forget about the old keys, which means effectively they become irrelevant. And if all of the endpoints have forgotten the old keys, we have forward secrecy. We have no key material to decipher old messages anymore. And the same for post-compromise security. We need new keys so that when we evict an attacker, the new key material is not known to the attacker. So if we look at an example very quickly of how a group could go. So Alice creates a group with Bob. And time-wise, we call this segment, we call it epoch 1. So in MLS, we work with epochs, which are just time segments. And so in this epoch 1, both Alice and Bob have key material they can use to securely exchange messages. And then Alice adds Charlie, for example, to the group, and then we are in epoch 2. So Charlie now does not have the key material from epoch 1. So Charlie couldn't possibly decrypt any messages that were sent in epoch 1. And now Bob does a key update for the whole group, which is something that enables post-compromise security. So now we have a new key for the whole group. And finally, Alice removes Charlie, for example, we have a new epoch. And at that point, new key material is being generated. And of course, Charlie will not have access to any new key material that Alice and Bob are going to use. So if we zoom in on epoch 1, and we look what happens when an epoch starts, essentially both Alice and Bob are able to derive key material that has the property of being forward secure. So effectively for every message, Alice can use a new key and then forget about the key. And Bob does the same, and they can also derive each other's keys. So when Alice uses key 1, then Bob can also derive the same key and decrypt Alice's message. So before we start going into more detail, very briefly, there's a concept that we call Init Keys. So every member of a group is going to publish Init Keys ahead of time. So whenever they start using a new device or sign up for some service. And so the idea behind that is that these Init Keys are handled by the delivery service, this part of the server infrastructure. And so fundamentally they contain credentials and a public key. So with that, you can immediately start doing end-to-end encryption with the members of the group right away. So it's like a bootstrapping mechanism. You can think of it conceptually like PGP, but it's only there to initiate a whole group. And of course, it's going to be confidential and authenticated. And I mentioned 2015, there was this asynchronous ratcheting trees concept, which was great because it introduced the notion of doing things efficiently in groups by using binary trees. And so this was later refined by the University INRIA from Paris, who came up with a similar concept that was a bit more flexible, and which is called treecan. So from now on, you're going to see a lot of binary trees on the slides. So the idea here is that we have a tree where we put all the participants at the leaf node. So the green nodes at the bottoms, they're called leaves. And so we have 6 participants here in a group. And so there is one rule about these trees, and that is that there is a secrecy invariant. So every leaf has a secret, which is only known to the member. And the intermediate nodes, like G, H, I, J, in between, they also have secrets. And finally, K, which we call the root node, also has a secret. Now, the secrecy invariant is that every member in the group knows the secrets from the intermediate nodes above them, all the way up to the root node K. Just a rule for now. So, as an example, C has the private keys for H, J, and K. And so this secret can be used to derive a public-private key pair. And so, all of a sudden, we can do stuff with that. We can, for example, have subgroups. So if we take the example of H, so both C and D know the public and private key of the intermediate node H. So if we want to send a message to just C and D, we might as well send it to only H, because both C and D will be able to decrypt it. Conversely, we can do the same with J, and then all of a sudden we send a message to A, B, C, and D. And finally, of course, with K, we can send a message to everybody. So we have these subgroups that make things a lot more efficient. And by definition, the root key, K in this case, is known to everybody in the group. And these trees really are the state of the protocol. And they can be changed over time with 4 operations. And one is create, as the name says. It's very straightforward. It's when you create a group. You can add members to a group. You can remove people. And you can do what we call an update, which is essentially updating the key material. So we're going to briefly walk through one example. I know it's a lot to take in when you see that the first time, and this should give you a brief overview. So how do we rotate the group key, which is very important when we've just evicted a member of the group, we want to have a new group key. How do we do that? Let's say F wants to do such an update. So F is in red here. What F is going to do, it's going to generate a fresh leaf key. So it will generate a random secret, and then it will take that secret, and conceptually it will hash it up the path all the way to the root. So this is what we call the direct path in orange here. So it will take the secret value in F, it will hash it, store it in I, hash it again, store it in K. And now we have a new group secret, except nobody except F knows about that. So we need to communicate that to the rest of the group. And since we have these efficient subgroups, we don't need to tell everybody individually what the new group key is. We can use the subgroups. So we call them the co-path because they're along this direct path. They're siblings of the direct path. E is a sibling of F, J is a sibling of I. And so it's good enough to just encrypt to E and J, and then we've reached everybody in the group. So this is a lot more efficient than doing 5 operations. We only do 2 here. So we're going to take the value of I and encrypt it to E. And then E also knows what's in I and can just hash it up to K, and then also knows K. And conversely, we do the same thing with J. Now you might wonder how you get such a tree in the first place. And that's rather straightforward. You can start a group by fetching init keys for every member, and those are readily available on the delivery service. And then you place these init keys as the leaves. So new members occupy one spot on the leave layer. And that's it. You can already communicate with the whole group, except that it's not very efficient. So as new members come online after they've been added, they can each do an update operation during which they will generate a new secret, hash it up all the way, and communicate that to the rest of the group. So after a little while, this tree will be complete in terms of inner nodes. Right now, they're completely empty. So this is really only about efficiency. There's no need to fill this tree other than to make it more efficient. And now finally, how do we remove someone? So say A wants to remove D. How do we do that? A sends a message to the whole group, which is confidential and authenticated, saying D should be removed. And so the rest of the group is going to do just that. It's going to remove D, but on top of that, it's also going to remove all the nodes on the direct path of D all the way to the root. Why do we do that? This is because we have this secrecy invariant. So D knew all the secrets in its direct path. So if we want to remove it effectively from the group, we need to delete everything that is a secret that is known to D. So now we have a tree that looks a little bit broken, but we still have some subgroups. We have G and I. So we can still encrypt to G and I and then to C separately if need be. But what we can also do is we can do an update to restore some of the inner nodes and to heal the tree in terms of efficiency. But again, this is really only about efficiency, and there wouldn't be any problem to have these holes in there. So what's interesting here is that the concept is very flexible because you can puncture this tree wherever you want. You can take out nodes, and it's still going to work. It's just not going to be as good in terms of efficiency. Brief overview, I already mentioned there are these 4 operations. We call them handshake messages, and they're exchanged among the members of the group. On top of that, we have application messages. So typically those are going to be text messages that group members exchange. So we have different requirements for ordering. Right now, control messages, they have to be completely ordered. So it's important to know who comes first. So if somebody tries to remove someone from the group while somebody else is trying to add someone, there needs to be an order to that. And so this is solved on the server side right now. Application messages, however, they only need to be somewhat ordered per sender. So it doesn't matter if Alice and Bob send messages at the same time. Since they have their own send chains, this is not going to create any conflict between the two. Let's go back to the efficiency to look at it in a little more detail. So this is an example of a pairwise protocol in a group of 6 members. And so they're all interconnected. They all have these sessions between them. And so things simply don't scale very well because you have to encrypt 5 times when somebody sends a message, and it could be expensive. I mean, it could be symmetric encryption only, but typically with, say, the double ratchet algorithm, it would also be Diffie-Hellman operations, which are more expensive. So pairwise sending, it works in O of n. So for those who have never seen that notation, it means the order of magnitude is the size of the group if there are n members. This hack I mentioned before, which improves the efficiency, sender keys. So the way this works is that rather than encrypting every message individually, what members can do is then they can fan out an encryption key to everybody else and then reuse that encryption key for new messages. So then they encrypt them once for the whole group, and the server takes care of fanning it out. So sending out this encryption key is still in O of n, which is not too great, but then sending every message afterwards is in O of 1, which is the best efficiency you can get. The problem here is it's not so great in terms of security. So you can have forward security because this encryption key could be hashed forward as long as everybody agrees on that. The problem is when you evict someone from a group, everybody needs to send out a new encryption key because you don't want the old encryption key to be known to the member who just got evicted. And so this is where you get a really bad efficiency. So either you don't care about that and you take that risk into account, or you have an order of magnitude of n squared, which is really bad because everybody sends out that key. So how does it look when we have these subgroups? Then if the tree is fully populated, which typically happens fairly quickly as members come online, then we can have an efficiency that is logarithmic, that is not linear anymore. And so for a large group, this really makes a difference. You can look at an example. So say we have a group of 100,000 members. Of course, this is a super large number that is not very realistic typically for consumer messaging, but in business messaging, there can be large groups of hundreds, thousands, maybe even 10,000s of people in it. And let's say that sending out a new key roughly takes 1 kilobyte of payload. A key is relatively small, but then there's a header, there's padding, etc. So we would have 100,000 operations, cryptographic operations, to send it out with a Pairwise protocol. And we're looking at a payload of 100 megabytes in such a large group. If we do that with trees, with MLS, we have 17 operations and a payload of 17 kilobytes. So it's an extreme example, of course, but it really illustrates what we can do here. And this makes a real difference because at the end of the day, it comes down to whether or not a user can use it. If you're on an old Android phone on a 2G network, it might be tricky to do 100,000 operations and then send out 100 megabytes. So we have a comparison chart here with the gray client fan out, which is constant, is always n, and then the sender keys, which can be very expensive sometimes, but great for sending out messages, and then MLS, which tries to be better in every operation than the rest. So we've talked about end-to-end encryption. What else do we need? So there is also metadata, and this is one of the hardest subjects for secure messaging protocols. What do we need to protect there? What's important? And we can distinguish between two kinds of metadata. There's observable metadata, which is what you can see when you look at network traffic packets. This is not really in scope for MLS. This can be solved with other techniques like onion routing, mixed nets, etc. For now, we assume there's TLS, which gives you some security on the transport layer between clients and server. And just to be clear, it's typically not in the scope of any end-to-end encrypted protocol, these observable metadata. And then there's persistent metadata, that you need to keep for some time, typically server-side. So this is more interesting, and we should look at that a little more closely. So what happens on the server side? So servers, they will keep messages in queues typically. So if there is a device and in the real world, that device will have a queue on the server with all the messages it hasn't fetched yet, and can eventually fetch when it comes back online. But for now, that's stored on the server. And so what we can do here, in order to minimize metadata, is that we can encrypt the sender of the message, because the server doesn't really care who the sender is long term. It needs to know it once, perhaps, but it really only cares to which queue it's supposed to put it. Then we can also have arbitrary padding of the messages. So we can make them all look very big so that on the server or the network side, you cannot really distinguish what's in the messages. So we have this multi-layered approach where we have two headers. One is visible to the server, the other one is encrypted under the group key. And then finally the actual messages is encrypted under a key that is sender specific, including the padding. And the padding, of course, also helps with observable metadata. Let's talk very briefly about deniability. This is a property that was introduced with OTR, and it means that you can refute certain things. So the problem with any protocol that uses exactly one key in a group is that that key is great and efficient because you only encrypt once, but you don't know who encrypted it. It could be anyone in the group. So in order to get authenticity, you need to sign messages. And as soon as you do that, you have some cryptographic proof of who the author is. So what can you do about that? And one way here is simply that the signing keys, the public keys for the signatures, they can be exchanged over a one-to-one deniable channel. So you still know when you receive a message who sent it, but you cannot really prove it to anyone. So the authorship becomes deniable. And also the participation in a group. So this is another lever of deniability that also becomes deniable. And all of that is opaque to the server, as I mentioned previously. Very interesting subject is federation. So I mentioned it earlier on the wish list. Can we achieve it? Are we limited to one delivery service? And so all a delivery service does is it's routing messages and it is ordering handshake messages. So we are still working on finding a way that this global ordering is not an issue, but for now it is a limitation of the TreeChem algorithm. So we have to work with that. But if we could find a way to distribute this ordering problem among different delivery services, then federation would actually become possible. So you could have multiple servers that intercommunicate. And so the strategy there is twofold. So there is a simple one, and that is without redundancy. So if you have a group, you can simply say that this group belongs to one of the delivery services, and that's a completely reasonable assumption in a number of scenarios. And then you have one delivery service that will be responsible for the ordering, and that's going to work well until that server goes down. And this is where you don't have any particular redundancy. However, if servers go down in general, you generally have a problem with messaging, not only with ordering. But if you wanted to tackle that problem, there would be a more fancy way of doing it, and that is simply to have a consensus of which delivery service is actually responsible for ordering at a given point in time. I want to say a few words about business messaging, because typically when we talk about messaging, we think about consumer messaging, but there is a new trend, really. In business communication, there is more and more people using smartphones, and so at work, they expect the same user experience they have at home. So they want to send short, informal messages in real time. And so far, typically what they had at work was just email. And there's this trend to move away from email and do more messaging. And so this is closely related to MLS. This is why I'm bringing it up. Some companies moved away completely from email, even only using messaging for internal communication because they found that to be a lot better. That's of course for every company to decide, but there are clear upsides, and there is this trend. But what's the real challenge here when we come to that? So there's the encryption challenge. And that is that the reality is that most business messaging today only uses TLS. So only transport encryption. It's not end-to-end encrypted, so messages are in clear text somewhere, typically on the server, or somewhere in between. And this has a lot to do with the fact that end-to-end encryption at scale in large groups, which are very important for business messaging, is complicated and expensive. So this is really the bottleneck. The other problem is that on the feature side of things, so most solutions only enable users of the same organization to talk to each other. And email is still popular because you can actually reach everyone. And this is where MLS can potentially also help with federation, that you can talk across company borders. Right, so to summarize very briefly what we've been talking about. So MLS aims to be a new standard for secure messaging, especially in large groups, with modern security properties. And the idea is for it to be robust and have a usable open specification, and can actually be used as a drop-in replacement for products that don't have end-to-end encryption yet or have a different kind that is not as good. So we have a website, messaginglayersecurity.rocks, which is going to point you at all the material that exists around MLS, the mailing list, and there's a lot of things on GitHub, the official draft documents. So that concludes this talk. I would like to thank everybody, of course, in the MLS group, but specifically Benjamin and Katriel who helped me with this talk. That's it for now. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Have you looked at Facebook's implementation of message franking and whether you would consider that being useful in MLS to report abuse to, I don't know, a service provider?
Yeah, so this was never really included in the scope as such. I mean, the mechanism is known. So we've had some discussions about it, and I think the conclusion was that it could be done outside of MLS. It's not fundamentally incompatible, but it's not necessarily a mechanism that everybody would want to use. So if we can solve it outside of MLS, I think that's good for MLS.
Okay, thank you.
Hi.
Yes.
Hi. The MLS is mostly seems to be a blockchain transactions. They're also the same kind of the binary tree transaction hashing everything will apply. Add, remove this. Anything which drawn from Bitcoin transactions to form the MLS protocol?
No, not directly. I mean, fundamentally, there is no consensus in MLS as such. There's no consensus needed. So potentially on the federation aspect, that could be interesting, but I think MLS, in terms of mechanics, was really inspired by TLS.
How about the backward compatibility? Like in the chain A, B, C, A and B first initially there is a group. C was added later point of time. So C want to see the previous messages which A and B are talking about. Is this possible?
So in order for that to be possible, you would have to build something on top of MLS so that either the keys of previous messages are being stored. The problem is you destroy the property of forward secrecy if you do that. So this is a trade-off of security and a feature. It's possible to do that outside of MLS.
Okay.
And we thought it's always easier to build a very secure protocol, and then if people want to weaken it afterwards, so be it. But it's much harder to build something that has all these features and then put some security on top of it.
Okay, thank you.
You mentioned when you were talking about deniability that people could preserve deniability by exchanging identity keys one-to-one over like a deniable one-to-one channel. But then doesn't that introduce the n-squared problem of having to do pairwise communications between everyone in the group?
Yes, I mean, at the time of the creation of the group, absolutely. This is linear, clearly. This is not efficient, but it gives you deniability. So unfortunately, we haven't found a way to do efficient deniability.
Thank you.
So you mentioned the inspiration is TLS, and one of the significant differences is that TLS deals with sessions that last for seconds, whereas this deals with sessions that last for months. One of the things that systems like OpenWhisper have to deal with is devices getting out of sync, losing their state, like OpenWhisper deals with a device getting a bad or old Android backup. So does MLS address the question of resyncing clients and retrying? And like, I was on Allo, and one of the really hard parts is getting retry that is secure.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So of course there is the assumption that the client state is not going to go out of sync initially. If it does, however, and that's a real life scenario, it just happens, memory gets corrupted. The naive approach right now is to remove the client and add it as a new device or as a new member. We're looking into exploring, what other mechanisms we could use there. So there is no session you can reset anymore as such. So it really comes down to adding and removing a client. Whether we make that one atomic operation is something we have to look into.
What's your timeline for like a deliverable for this?
So the question was what the timeline is. Great question. So no, it is. I didn't mention it in the talk. So right now, the core protocol, we're trying to stabilize it because we want to enter a phase where academia can really start looking at it and come up, with pen and paper proofs and formal verification. And if we keep on changing the protocol all the time, that's not very motivating. So that is what is hopefully going to start soon, and we expect that to last a year maybe. So that sometime 2020 we are in a state that is maybe not final in IETF terminology, but very close to that, so that we can start implementing it into some products and see how it works. If it works. It will work.